Well, US President Donald Trump has named John Bolton as his new national security advisor. Mr. Bolton is a former US ambassador to the UN and also served as Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security.
A conservative hawk, Mr. Bolton was an unabashed supporter of the war in Iraq and advocates using military force against Iran and North Korea. Well, to tell us what this may mean for America's foreign policy direction, we're talking with John Blaxland, Professor in International Security and Intelligence Studies at the ANU. John, good to talk to you this morning.
Thanks for having me on the program, Andrew.
So what does this signal from Donald Trump in the appointment of John Bolton?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is that HR MacMaster doesn't quite fit with the approach that Donald Trump wants to pursue. MacMaster, although his reputation has been sullied a little bit by the fact that he has been out there defending Trump on a number of issues where it clearly was marginally appropriate, he has nonetheless acted as a significant check on Trump's more hawkish ambitions, and that has clearly not worked as far as Trump's concerned, even though it probably has worked in terms of what people like Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, thinks. So the appointment of Bolton, though, does speak to a different approach, and it comes as Donald Trump is now looking to focus more intently on the issue of North Korea and the engagement with North Korea, and also in mind of his concerns about the situation in Iran and his desire to apply far more pressure on Iran. Of course, we know, as you mentioned, Andrew, at the outset, his reputation is that of a hawk. He's an unrepentant defender of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Most of those who were involved will concede that at least, the United States probably could have made different choices there. John Bolton is pretty much unrepentant. Speaks to a mindset that's particularly worrying to many observers, many pundits, because, when you look back at the people who you can compare Donald Trump with, one of the presidents most often compared with Trump is Richard Nixon, who had his own approach of the kind of madman theory of engaging North Vietnam during the Vietnam War back in the late 60s, early 70s. And he was looking to make the North Vietnamese think that he's crazy enough to completely obliterate them. Of course, that wasn't really plausible because Nixon was a lifelong politician. He'd been at this game for a long time. Trump's in a different camp. So by getting someone like Bolton along, who's an unrepentant defender of the Iraq invasion in 2003, which we know how that's turned out, he's sending a very clear signal to Kim Jong-un and to the regime in Iran that the United States is not going to stand for the arrangements of the past, is not going to stand for the deal that Obama did with the Europeans on Iran a couple of years back, and wants to act decisively, if not militarily. And that, of course, has the potential to do one of two things: either induce a cave-in by Kim Jong-un so that he makes big concessions, or gets them bristled and reacting strongly to it, and lead us to the precipice.
Yeah, it's almost the carrot and the stick approach, isn't it? In that you've got the carrot, as in the talks between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, and the stick being John Bolton.
Indeed, and that is a deliberate, I think, part of the intimidatory tactics that Trump is applying to get his art of the deal through. He wants to be the guy who, unlike Bush, Clinton, Obama, actually managed to pull something off with Kim Jong-un, and at the same time apply pressure, psychological if not physical, on the Iranians to change their tack. And that's, of course, got ramifications across the Middle East.
Just before we get to Iran, as far as North Korea is concerned, of course, this comes at a time when the United States is ramping up its presence in the Western Pacific. Is it fair enough to say it's almost on a war footing?
Yes, in fact, Andrew, the US military, there's a lot of talk around in the last few months of the US military essentially building up its war stocks in Guam, in Hawaii, in its bases in the Western Pacific and in Northeast Asia, to be in a position to act after the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang. we are now in that window. So the United States is poised in a way that is akin to the way it was poised prior to the Iraq invasion of 2003. Now, there are some differences in terms of the imperatives there to act. The operational tempo has certainly raised for the United States, and that means that they are at a tempo that is actually hard to sustain for a long time. It's sustainable for a few months, but essentially, with Bolton arriving, the kind of the impetus for action, the plausibility inside the White House of those targeted, punitive strikes to try and engender a concession out of Kim Jong-un become all that more plausible.
And John, as far as Iran is concerned, it looks as though President Trump and John Bolton would be on the same page, because both have, of course, said that they're opposed to that 2015 Iran nuclear deal.
Indeed, and that is, I'm sure in Tehran there'll be a lot of reading of the tea leaves to try and discern what this means, and for them to be looking to shore up their position. Now, we know that Iran has been facing internal protests in the last few months. There is a degree of dissatisfaction internally in Iran with the focus on external affairs, with the focus on funding the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps for military operations in Syria and in Iraq, and not on infrastructure, schooling, and on openness in Iran itself. So there are some pressures on Iran to make some concessions, but we know that with Bolton in office as the National Security Advisor, Trump's instincts to actually renege on the deal and to actually up the ante, ratchet up pressure on Iran is a real one. Of course, that then puts Australians to a certain extent in the crosshairs, because we know Australians are still in Iraq, where a number of Iranians are still operating, and where Iran has enormous influence still to this day. So what happens next? If there is a confrontation between the United States and Iran, it's highly likely the Iranians would there try and do something asymmetric, something that is attacking a US vulnerability, and the US is vulnerable with its troops alongside Australians and New Zealanders and others inside Iraq. That's a very disconcerting prospect.
Professor John Blaxland from the ANU. Thanks very much.
My pleasure, Andrew.